Let the games begin.
Catch those puppies!
This holiday season, if you're going after Dalmatians, you're going down. Glenn Close.
Good evening, madam.
Disney's 101 Dalmatians. Rated G. Starts Wednesday, November 27th at a theater near you.
What is there to say about the classic animated Disney film 101 Dalmatians that hasn't already been said? It's clearly a classic film and a shining example of a children's novel that was, for better or worse, adapted by Disney and now is indistinguishable from their brand. You can't look at 101 Dalmatians and not think Disney. It also, strangely enough, has spawned more remakes, sequels, and spin-offs than most people are probably aware of. There was the 1997 cartoon, the 2003 direct-to-video sequel, Patch's London Adventure, the more recent cartoon, 101 Dalmatian Street, which is pretty good to be honest. I'd say check that out if you're interested. But probably the most notable of the bunch, and the one that I had the most desire to discuss, is the 1996 live-action remake. As of lately, Disney has been no stranger to remaking their animated properties, and while there are tons of people out there who willingly eat that shit up, I have a strong dislike towards them. There's just something about the way that so many of them feel like such a direct copy of the original films that they're based on. They also kind of reinforce the idea that animation is a lesser art form than live action, even though so many of them heavily rely on the use of CG animation to make them work. The only remake of the bunch that I really enjoyed was Pete's Dragon, and then there was the ones that I am just okay with, like the 2016 Jungle Book and 101 Dalmatians, which brings me back to the point of this video. The 1996 adaptation of 101 Dalmatians is actually the second live-action remake of a Disney movie. The first being the Stephen Sommers directed adaptation of Jungle Book. Disney just loves to remake Jungle Book for some reason. But come on, did his Jungle Book movie have Glenn Close? I don't think so. The film was directed by Stephen Herek and written by John Hughes of all people. John Hughes you're probably familiar with, but I have to say, this is far from his best work. Stephen Herek has actually worked on a ton of projects, but the two most important films he ever directed were Critters and Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
Excellent!
Like many of Disney's recent live-action adaptations, the film takes very heavy inspiration from its animated counterpart, often recreating iconic scenes and following roughly the same plot. There are, however, quite a few changes as well. Most noticeably, the film is set in modern-day London. Well, 1996 modern day, which differs greatly from the animated film, which, despite releasing in the 60s, takes place in 1958, which is close enough to be honest. And with modern times comes modern changes. Like in this adaptation, Roger, played by Jeff Daniels, is a video game developer, which that in itself is fine, but I don't believe the people who designed the fake Dalmatian-themed video game used here have ever played a real game themselves. Games did not look like this in 1996, unless it's intended to be some sort of Don Bluth-esque QuickTime Events game. Anita in this is played by Jolie Richards, and both her and Jeff Daniels have terrific chemistry here. Any scenes involving the two of them comes off as utterly charming, and it's some of the best stuff in the movie. Yes, their marriage seems a tad unrealistically rushed, but it's a kids movie, I'm fine with it. The way in which Cruella de Vil is integrated into the story is a bit clever as well. In the original, she's described as a former schoolmate of Anita, while here Anita works for her as a fashion designer, which honestly makes it more clear why they don't just call the police on her in the first place. Cruella is of course played by Glenn Close, who really steals the show here. She does an excellent job at bringing a cartoon to life, and anytime she's on screen, the film is a blast.
The devil take it! They're mongrels! No spots! No spots at all! What horrible little white rats!
Cruella's sheer insanity is also played up a bit more in this film, as She has a henchman willing to break into zoos and steal animal skins for her. Now, the movie doesn't exactly explain why she needs these exact puppies to build her coat. I mean, she is rich, she could just buy them off of someone else without telling them what she intends to use them for, but that's just as much a fault of the original film as it is the remake. Also, her costumes in this movie are just stunning. She may be a puppy killer, but let me tell you, Cruella is a total fashion icon. One of the major differences between this movie and the animated one is that the dogs do not talk, and thank God for that. I don't think the CG technology was quite ready for that in 1996, but you just know if this film was made today, they would all have had something to say. You could have done something like the weird telepathy thing in Homeward Bound where their lips don't move, but I'm glad they presented it how they did. There's something purely delightful about seeing a film such as this where the dogs just act like dogs. No constant unfunny jokes or celebrity voice actors. I also imagine it must have been incredibly difficult training all of those animals. This seems like one of those movies that would be an absolute nightmare to shoot. There are definitely positives to using CG over real animals today, but the presence of real animals just has that nostalgic feel for me and gives me a greater appreciation of the amount of effort that goes into something like that. And I'm not saying that there's no effort in CG animation. That's an entirely different kind of effort and probably deserves way more respect than it gets. While this isn't the most 90s film I've ever seen, there are quite a few elements of it that will remind you how of its time it is. For one, this movie focuses a lot more on slapstick. This is obviously because of the Home Alone craze that lots of 90s movies were trying to bank off of. In some areas, it works. I don't find it hilarious, but some of the stuff with Horace and Jasper is entertaining enough. It's also worth pointing out that Jasper here is played by Hugh Laurie of Stuart Little fame. There's also a new henchman added called Skinner. Yes, it's very on the nose, but he adds absolutely nothing to the movie. I honestly don't know why he is in this other than the fact that I guess someone has to skin the animals for Cruella. The slapstick doesn't really become a problem till the end of the movie, when it's used to defeat Cruella. It just feels so toned down from the crazy, over-the-top ending of the animated film with the high-speed car chase and all. I understand that would be incredibly difficult to film, but Cruella never really comes off as a threat in the finale. Rather than the stakes getting higher, the film just kind of fizzles out towards the end, which is a real shame because I think that's the movie's biggest issue.
Cruella de Vil has the last laugh.
However, one of the very 90s aspects I do really like about this film is the score. It's just so uplifting and magical, and I really miss that kind of music in family pictures. It's just too sweet.
Well, will you look at that?
Overall, Disney's 1996 adaptation of 101 Dalmatians is a pretty flawed movie, but one I enjoy nonetheless. I think Glenn Close's performance and the 90s pureness of it all is really what appeals to me. I wouldn't call this movie a must-watch of any kind, but if I learned one thing from it...
It's not hatred that's important, it's a desire to annihilate.
But what about 102 Dalmatians?
Glenn Close, Disney's 102 Dalmatians. Rated G. Now playing.
Yes, 4 years later, we got 102 Dalmatians, the sequel that nobody really asked for, but Disney was set on making sure it happened. You know those sequels that happened just too late to capture the interest of the original film's audience, but not late enough for the original to be nostalgic yet? Well, that's this movie. This also happens to be, to my knowledge, the very first movie I saw in a theater, so it has some sort of significance to me, even if I can only slightly remember the experience. This here's a film that's incredibly different from the first, and that's something you'll notice right away from the very in-your-face opening. If this doesn't scream the year 2000, I don't know what will. This time directed by Kevin Lima, the director of such animated classics as Tarzan and A Goofy Movie. He He'd also go on to direct Enchanted, and a lot of that movie's style is evident here. The movie takes place 3 years later after the original, with Cruella cured of her fur coat obsession, and released on probation with a newfound love of animals. Anita and Roger are this time replaced by the characters of Chloe and Kevin. Chloe is played by Alice Evans, and acts as Cruella's probation officer. Kevin is played by the fantastic Mr. Ewan Grufford, and runs a worn-down dog shelter. Chloe doesn't believe Cruella has actually changed, while Kevin's view is a much more optimistic one. But I don't know, guys. As the late 90s, early 2000s girl group Nobody's Angel would ask, what you gonna do with your second chance? Okay, obviously Cruella goes back to her old ways, otherwise we wouldn't have a movie. Instead of Pongo and Perdita, the parents of the puppies in this film are Dipstick and Dottie. Dipstick, of course, being one of the original Dalmatian puppies from the first film, which heavily suggests that Roger and Anita sold some of their Dalmatian puppies from the first movie, which is the logical thing to do. It just seems a bit strange that they'd sell one of the original puppies that Pongo and Perdita gave birth to. Kinda feels like there's a small chunk of story missing here.
I remember you as a puppy.
This here's a film that's a lot zanier than the first. It really does feel like it's going more for goofy fun than its more charming predecessor, but I say that works for the decade it was released in. The film also has more darkly comedic moments. Keep in mind that's dark for a children's Disney film. I actually appreciate that element of it. They really allowed Glenn Close to just go all out, and once again, the costume design here, absolutely gorgeous. Unfortunately, this movie still has quite a few downsides to it, the most blatant being the addition of the talking parrot Waddlesworth, who just won't shut up.
Come on, Wadsworth. Come on, fly. You can do it.
No, I've told you once, I've told you 100 times, we dogs can't fly. Woof, woof, see? Now stand aside, bird brain.
He's a bird that thinks he's a dog, and he's voiced by none other than Eric Idle. It feels like his addition was solely done because some of the writers or executives thought kids would get bored watching a bunch of puppies with no dialogue. But come on, it's puppies. If anything, the human dialogue is what's gonna put the kids to sleep. There's also a central puppy in this one who gets more focus than the rest, this one being Oddball, an albino puppy whose trigger word is spots, seeing as she has none. And yes, it's hard not to find the scenes with this puppy adorable, but oftentimes they'll replace it with a CG dog for scenes that were difficult to execute, and it does not hold up well. Can I just say how cute it is that Chloe and Kevin put on a movie for their dogs while out on their date?
Now here you are, the best spaghetti in a town.
There's also the return of more slapstick in this film, but for the most part, it doesn't overdo it. But when it does, the film can be straight up brutal. Good God, that man will never hold anything ever again. I do find this movie to be much better structured than its predecessor. It doesn't just fizzle out, instead ending in this insane Wallace and Gromit-esque death trap of an ending that really goes all out and looks super expensive. Maybe I'm just a baby, but this cake sequence was pretty horrifying as a child, and it's still kind of scary as an adult. It's surprisingly brutal for a kid's movie, but I guess she deserved it, wanting to skin puppies and all.
How do we get out of this mess?
Piece of cake.
By the end of the movie, Cruella is captured by the police and thrown back in prison, which leaves the more pessimistic Chloe character pretty much telling Kevin, I told you so.
Unless she's rehabilitated.
No, Alonso. Cruella will always be Cruella.
So the message of this movie is that some people don't change and never will. This is like the anti-Rhea, like don't put your faith in anyone, kids, they will screw you over. Although perhaps this is the much more realistic message we should be teaching kids.
It's not hatred that's important, it's a desire to annihilate.
In the end, 102 Dalmatians isn't really that bad a movie. I'd say it's just okay, with a few aspects that improve upon the original, but others that bog it down. I'd say if you had to watch any of these movies, go with the first one, although you're not really missing much by skipping both of them. Kids will likely enjoy these movies, so if you have a kid and you want to show it to them, go right ahead. These are like delightfully harmless movies. Thank you to everyone who watched this video. I've got plenty of other movie and TV reviews on my channel, so feel free to check those out if you're interested. Until then, I'll be rocking out to Digga Digga Dog by Oren Waters. Bye. Digga digga dog, digga digga dog. Digga digga dog, digga digga dog. Digga